Hey there, this is HanDIYman 007, and today I wanted to share with you my wife's home office desk, version 2. But don't be fooled, at a distance it may look like a typical L-shaped desk, but she had actually expanded the original table dimensions underneath using 2 pieces of wood from an old shelf, a bunch of clamps, and covered the surface with purple anti-slip matting. While the height of the table is perfect for her, the original surface area could only accommodate her laptop, external keyboard, and mouse. For a time, she was quite happy with her design until she realized that the function of the table eventually evolved, and with that came the need for more space. Because it has also become a space for her sewing projects, charging our devices, drawing activities for our kids, incubation area for her succulents, and even a convenient dining table where we occasionally feed our kids. It has become, for a lack of a better term, my wife's command center. So this version 2 was simply not enough anymore, and after all, an uneven surface created by 2 pieces of wood on its side held down by just clamps isn't that sturdy and sustainable for a table in the long run. So armed with a list of design features, my wife asked me to create even more desk space and reimagine the table extension attachment to be more stable and multifunctional. And here are some of the features she wanted for version 3. While the desktop needed to be more spacious, it has to have a seamless flat surface. It should be sturdy and stable enough for various objects to be placed on it. It has to have a clean provision for power cables and wires. Oh, and it needs to have a storage space for her sewing machine. My wife had to wait a few weeks before I finally had the bandwidth to address the situation. So watch until the very end of this video to learn and see how we redesigned this table from version 2 into version 3. Let's go! So, in order to get the right measurements for our version 3 extension, we first have to remove all the clamps and the 2 pieces of wood. Then, peel off the slip-proof lining. This reveals the original desk underneath, which as you can see has a tempered glass surface held in place by a steel frame. After getting the dimensions, all I had to do was calculate how long the overhang could extend on both sides of the desk without being too long that this 3/4 inch thick plywood would begin to droop down under its own weight. Then, I drew my cut lines here, which in essence forms a big letter L. Now, let's cut it to size. As I continue to cut the big letter L from this piece of plywood, it's important to set ample support below so that the pieces will not suddenly drop to the floor right after cutting. Since this next cut is impossible to do on top of the sawhorses, I figured it's much safer to do this on top of this concrete platform instead. And by removing this excess part, we can now see our big letter L. Finally, we'll cut this section of the short side of the L to get the exact dimensions I was aiming for. And that should do it. Now, it's time to dry fit this single piece on top of our desk. So what I'm doing here is aligning the wooden extender to the center of the table, because later on, I will secure it in place with 4 pairs of bolts and nuts to the steel frame underneath. But first we have a problem. For some reason, the layers in this corner of the plywood came loose. So instead of buying and cutting another piece of plywood, I decided to repair this with wood glue. I'm using a thin paint scraper as my applicator to really get the glue deep inside the layers. Then I use all my available clamps. If you don't have clamps, you can lay the wood on the ground and place heavy objects on top of it. By the way, I learned that wood glue should only be applied on bare wood since it will never bond properly on a painted surface. Now, we'll wipe the excess off with paper, then with a damp cloth. And we'll add more clamps. We'll have to wait at least 30 minutes for the glue to dry. For the firmest bond, it's recommended to wait overnight. Finding value from this video? Hit subscribe and the bell icon to get notified of new uploads. Thanks! So while waiting for the glue to dry, I'll move on to cutting the pieces I need for a drop-down shelf as a storage space for my wife's sewing machine. Might as well use the sewing machine's box to measure the dimensions I need. This section here is for the shelf walls. I need a left and right wall, so I'm going to cut this further into 2 pieces. I have to make sure though that I have enough to produce 2 panels with equal lengths. Okay, I think we're good and ready to cut. That's our first panel, and let me cut off some excess from the second panel. Now, we have 2 identical pieces of wood. Layers in the corner of our wall panel also came loose, so I had to fix it with wood glue. But since all my clamps are in use, I just clamped it along with our L-shaped piece that we're also waiting to dry. Meanwhile, let's move on to the other side of our L-shaped piece to make a grommet hole. Drilling a hole about 2 inches from the edge of the desk right below will allow us to pass through power cables instead of wrapping them around the edges. Better cable management means a cleaner overall look. For this task, I'm first using a drill bit for wood to bore a hole all the way through. Then I switch to a hole saw attachment and use the hole as our guide. For a clean cut, the trick is to drill only halfway through the wood. Otherwise, the wood will tear up on the other side if we drilled all the way. So we flip this over and continue drilling from this side until we hit the halfway mark. Remember the hole we drilled earlier? It now serves as our marker to ensure that we'll end up with 2 aligned sides of a single hole, which produces a clean and perfect circle. As soon as the wood glue dried, I begin to sand all my pieces to a smooth finish using a 120 grit sandpaper. By the way, I could have sanded manually, but for this project that has a lot of surface to cover, I opted to use a power sander to make the job faster and easier. I'm starting off with these 2 panels that will become our shelf walls. I'm sanding them while clamped together not only to save on time, but also to ensure that at the end of the task, they will have exactly the same dimensions. So it's very important that as I turn them over to sand all the sides, that they don't move or become misaligned. Okay, I think they are as identical as I can possibly make them. Now it's time to sand all the surfaces. In using a power sander, it's important to keep the machine always moving, never staying too long on one spot. This ensures we have an even finish and at the same time extend the life of our sandpaper. Notice that the color of our wooden surface has lightened up after a few passes. As such, comparing dark and light areas is an easy way to tell which sections we need to sand some more. The goal is to make the dark areas a bit lighter. Of course, the ultimate test is gliding our hands on the surface to check if it's smooth enough to our satisfaction. It's time to fasten this desk extension to the frame underneath. We begin by drilling 2 holes that are exactly aligned to the steel frame below on one side. Then drill 2 matching holes on the other side. We stop drilling when we hit steel. Before I lift this up, I'm making a final check if my holes are indeed aligned with the steel frame. Okay, time to lift this out of the way. See these white divots made by the drill? This is where we will drill through the steel. So from a drill bit for wood, I switched to a drill bit for metal to create our bolt holes. Let me do a quick test. Good. Then, let's do our second hole. Good. Moving on the other side of the table, we repeat the exact process. As you may have already guessed, later on, we're going to secure our wooden desk extension with 4 bolts and lock the bolts in place with metal nuts. Now let's do a little cleaning before we position our extension. I also decided to keep the slip-proof matting because I figured its rubbery composition can give the tempered glass some protection from vibration. At last, we can now secure our desk extension on top of this. At this point, I'm just making some adjustments to align our holes on the table with the holes on the steel frame. Then we screw in 4 pairs of steel bolts and nuts. I realized too late that we actually needed 2 grommet holes. So I'm making this hole now after I have already moved everything into our bedroom. We basically apply the same technique that I showed earlier to create a clean hole without any tear. The only difference is that I need to vacuum off the sawdust quickly before my wife finds out I'm making a mess in here. So here's our desk extension secured in place with nuts and bolts and with the required grommet holes. So what's next? Paint? Not exactly. Instead of paint, we opted for self-adhesive, waterproof PVC paper. And here are some of the options we went through. This is a 45 cm by 4 meter closet liner, and I got it for 88 pesos from the DIY shop a couple of years ago. But my wife found the pattern too dark for her taste. This, on the other hand, is a 45 cm by 10 meter waterproof wallpaper my wife purchased online for 136 pesos. This is actually what I will use for my own ergonomic desk in a future video. Now this is the design my wife went for. At the back, it has a grid pattern that you can readily use as cut lines. All that's needed is to cut it to size, peel off the back, and stick on a clean, smooth surface. So here we go. Now let me show you some of the features of this desk extension and see if they have satisfied all the requirements. A flat and seamless surface with plenty of space for laptop use, a meal with the kids where they sit on the edge of the bed in front of the desk, or even sewing projects. Speaking of sewing, here's the drop-down shelf where my wife keeps her sewing machine within easy reach. And it still has plenty of space for her notebooks and other stuff. She also cut out an old rubber playmat and repurposed it as a protective shelf liner. Speaking of protection, remember our purple anti-slip matting? There was some excess and my wife decided to cut and wrap it around the table extender using a staple gun. It now serves as protection for our kids in case they accidentally bump the sides or corners, which happens quite a bit. In terms of strength, the entire attachment is held down by 4 metal bolts and secured underneath with washers and nuts. Just behind the drop-down shelf, we have mounted a power strip where all our chargers are plugged in. The cables pass through the grommet hole, so there's nothing dangling. This side of the desk is our area where we charge all our devices like our smartphones, tablet, and power bank. Right now, I'm charging our emergency lamps. And on this side is a space for my wife's ornamental plants, art crafts, office supplies, mounted lamp, her laptop, and even her rechargeable mini fan. So instead of spending money buying a bigger desk, perhaps the one that you already have just needs an extender similar to this one. This is HanDIYman 007. Thanks for watching, and you can do this.